to bring their different perspectives and assessment of this international financial crisis. The way the session is going to be organized is I will introduce the participants very briefly and make some couple of remarks and invite each panelist to address the plenary, and I'd like them to keep to 10 minutes their presentations, and then we'll open for Q&A. We have here today Devesh Kapoor from the University of Pennsylvania, Patrick Watson from the Institute of Social and Economic Studies at the University of West Indies, Anthony Birchwood from the Caribbean Center for Money and Finance at the University of West Indies, and Mr. Winston Dukaran, the head of COP. He's not yet here with us, but we will start the discussions, and he will join us when he comes in a few minutes. We all have heard extensively about the international financial crisis and how this crisis is affecting both the developed and the developing world. Being in the Caribbean, with a number of countries that are high-income countries, quite developed, high middle-income countries, and the whole spectrum of economic development. At least from a perspective of the United Nations, we know that the situation for the developing country, which contributed the least to the crisis, are really severe and has led some economists to warn of a lost decade of development, which could have catastrophic consequences for rich and poor countries alike. Good morning. Good to see you. Mr. Dukaran, very nice to see you, and a very good morning. Some of the recent assessments of the impact of the ongoing economic crisis increasingly highlight the deteriorating social and political fallout in the least developed countries and middle-income countries as well. Prospects for an early recovery have faded, forcing countries to prepare for a prolonged downturn in trade, investment, and employment. The United Nations assesses that in 2009, for the first time in history, global economic growth has entered negative territory. Credit flows have dried up, and major investment firms and lending institutions have been wiped out off the map. Jobs are disappearing by more than 1 million a month, according to the ILO, and trade has dropped at the steepest rate since the Great Depression, as the World Trade Organization has observed. Different organizations, financial institutions, governments, and groups, the group of the 20 and the group of 8, have made a number of assessments and prescribed different approaches to addressing. What I hope we will hear today from our panelists is an assessment of the origins of the crisis, and more importantly, what would be some feasible responses to this crisis. I therefore like to invite Professor Kapoor to open the forum and share with us his perspectives on this issue. Devesh.
Thank you. In the past few decades, we've seen a multitude of financial crises with severe economic consequences, but most of these have centered in developing countries. In the 1980s, you had the Latin American debt crisis. In the 90s, you had the Mexican so-called tequila crisis, and of course, the major sort of Asian financial crisis. Now, each of these was centered in the South, and most of the negative effects were felt also in the South, although there were some mild, ripple effects on the North. The crisis each of the crises was blamed on developing countries, the lack of sort of regulation, poor economic policies, feckless governments, and crony capitalism, so on and so forth. While developing countries, they pointed to the systemic role of the global financial system, weak global regulation, but this was generally sort of ignored. This time, however, the shoe is on the other foot. Now, but nonetheless, what is sort of clear is that when the North when the North sort of sneezes, the South, of course, catches a very severe cold. So despite the fact that the origins of the crisis are in the North, there'll be very deep and severe effects on the South. Now, very, very sort of briefly, this year and probably the next, we're going to see the worst post-World War II recession in the world. The total expected write-downs of assets of the Western banks will be in the order of $4 trillion. Now, this will be spread across banks, across insurance companies, sort of hedge funds, pension funds, so on and so forth. Now, the main question here is, what are the effects on sort of developing countries? The first of all is because of liquidity dried up, financial flows to LDCs fell very sharply. Trade collapsed, both because trade financing was not available and also, of course, the general slowdown of global economic activity. The greatest or the most the negative effects have been on those developing countries which are heavily dependent on external private finance. This is particularly true of countries in East Europe and the Baltics. Also, the effects have been very negative on those which are very dependent on external trade. So even a country as reasonably well managed as Singapore has seen an economic contraction of nearly 9% of its economy. Countries which were heavily dependent on the export of commodities have also seen a major collapse of demand. But there have been some silver linings, especially for those countries, the poor countries of Africa, countries like Bangladesh, which are both oil and food importers, because food price inflation, oil price inflation, especially sort of affects poor countries which are large importers of these items. Now, the question I think which is most interesting is the broader systemic effects of the crisis. I think one thing which is clear is that the developmental model of the past 3 decades, where markets were supreme and the role of the state was undermined, that will change. But this is not going to be a simple return to the past. I think trade will continue to be an important driver of growth. But in particular, the hegemonic role of finance and the secondary role of the real sector, that is likely to be reversed. And the role of the government will increase, but not in the sense of a greater role of state-owned enterprises, but especially the regulatory role of the state, which had been severely undermined in the past few decades, will have to be rebuilt. There's going to be a shift in global economic power. That shift was already taking place, but that will be accelerated by this crisis, in particular sort of away from Europe and North America towards Asia. The rise of the BRICS is a well-known phenomenon, and of course, especially the rise of China. The most sort of recent estimates are that in this year, when Europe and North America will see a severe collapse of economic activity, China will still grow at about 8%. India will grow at about 6%. These are by far the highest growth rates in the world, and are very respectable growth rates even in the absence of a crisis. Interestingly enough, past 2 months, there has been a sharp increase in financial flows to these countries. It's been about 20 billion in the last 2 months sort of alone. In India, which I follow more closely, financial flows of the past sort of 8 weeks have been about $1 billion a week. So you have seen a sort of return of finance, but only to the much larger developing countries. The small, weak ones are going to face much more severe problems. I think a bigger systemic change will be on the leadership of the US, particularly its intellectual leadership, which was the one that really forced this financial model on the global system. And of course, also I think there'll be severe challenges on the supremacy of the US, the dollar, as the reserve currency of the world. The global institutional framework is changing. Global governance is changing from G7 to the G20. And there's been, interestingly enough, a very, very radical shift compared to the past few decades in the role of the IMF. Very, very briefly, developing countries had long asked for a major increase in the resources of the IMF that had always been blocked. But because of this crisis, there's going to be a tripling of the resources of the IMF from $250 to $750 billion. So developing countries had asked since the mid-70s for a sharp increase in the issuance of SDRs, which had always been blocked by Germany and the UK and the United States. But now there's going to be a tenfold increase in the issuance of SDRs to the total of $250 billion. Also, very interestingly, conditionalities in IMF loans, which had been a big bugbear of developing countries, that's going to be severely cut back. And of course, largely, I think what is driving this is the fact that for the first time, major European countries are going to be borrowers of the IMF. And of course, Europe has a lot of power in the IMF, so it is very unlikely to impose conditionalities on itself. Conditionalities are fine as long as they're imposed on others. I think we'll also see a sort of reform of the quotas of the IMF, which will give developing countries much greater voice. And for the first time, it's been agreed that both the managing director of the IMF and the president of the World Bank, which was a sort of a monopoly of Europe and the United States, respectively, that will actually be open to global talent and not be a sort of monopoly of a few powers. Finally, I think what I'd like to sort of point out is that what we're going to see is, because of this huge economic and financial crisis, there'll be very large fiscal deficits in the North. This, coupled with prospects of lower economic growth and growing future fiscal claims on the budgetary resources of the North because of an aging population, I think will have two very sobering implications. One is that the prospects for foreign aid down the line from the North will be much more circumscribed. There just is not going to be that fiscal space. Second, many global problems which are rearing their heads, and I particularly want to emphasize the issue of climate change, because we're going to have these negotiations this year in Copenhagen. I think there will be much less space for the North to be able to offer the sorts of financial flows and bargains for the South to accept the severe cutbacks in emissions that are essential to get an agreement on a problem which has very long-term systemic sort of implications for everyone. But I think the economic and financial space is likely to be much less to allow an agreement to be reached. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Marcia, and welcome to St. Augustine, everybody. I will go through, this is really about the Caribbean. I prepared it in the first instance for Trinidad, but a lot of what I'm about to say is true of the Caribbean, and I'll extend it to there. So this is what the presentation is going to look like. We begin, I'm saying I borrow some words from one of my colleagues on campus, Delisle Worrell. We are sailing in uncharted waters. We have never seen a crisis like this one, and it's not good enough to talk about a bad weather. It is a veritable hurricane that we are facing. And no matter how well we may have prepared, it's going to be very difficult to deal with what follows. You've already heard that we are facing probably the worst crisis since the war. In fact, it's probably since the late 20s, early 30s. The old remedies need not apply. Because we are sailing in uncharted waters, we may not understand what has happened. And if you remember, in the last time, the canes came to the rescue to some extent. Many people are thinking that that might work, but my own view is that that may not necessarily be the case. And even the best are disagreeing. I don't know if you know those two names. Krugman. Krugman is the Nobel laureate for this year. He has referred to Barrow, someone that the French would call Nobelisable. This is a Nobel Prize candidate. He has referred to his economics as bonehead economics and has classified Barrow as a bonehead economist. And of course, these are two of the best economists that we have around. Incidentally, Barrow will be speaking at the conference of the Soleasis next year as the distinguished Sir Arthur Lewis lecturer. So we are going to have a bonehead economist speaking next year, and it will in fact be the main event. The indices are dubious. There are low energy prices. Well, gas, the price has gone up in recent time to about 60, but that is low relative to what it has been, and on the basis of which plans have been made for the country like Trinidad and Tobago. But what is low for us may be high for other people. Employment is relatively high in Trinidad and Tobago, but already there is a lot of downward pressure here and in the rest of the Caribbean. In the case of Trinidad and Tobago, the foreign exchange reserves, and in the countries like Barbados and so on, there's a relatively healthy supply, but they are declining. And in the case of Trinidad and Tobago, which still has a relatively certain source, it's declining pretty fast. The rate of exchange against the US dollar is holding, but is under considerable pressure. Those of you who are familiar with the Trinidad and Tobago market will know that there is a heavy demand of late, and many banks have resorted to rationing on the understanding that the central bank will do the necessary replenishing. Public sector indebtedness, the central bank governor referred to that. I'll show you a graph in a little while. I added it only yesterday so you could have a look at it. There's, of course, the turbulence in the financial sector, which we did not anticipate in the first instance to be so rapid, but it has come through the events of CLICO, and that has affected the entire Caribbean. The economic resilience is low in Trinidad and Tobago, largely because of the lack of diversification away from the traditional sectors. In the case of Trinidad and Tobago, the energy sector. And throughout the Caribbean, in particular, I would say in Trinidad and Tobago, there is questionable governance. And I will refer to some of that as we go through. Now, the loss of jobs in the US and the general slowdown there will continue to affect us. We have not, you heard the previous speaker speak about the BRIC countries holding up well against the US because they have successfully, to some extent, decoupled. That's the fancy word the economists use these days, have decoupled from the US economy and from the European economy, and they are strengths and mights in their own right. But we have not done so in the Caribbean. So we continue to depend on the fortunes of the US, and to the extent that that is not likely to come right away, there is changing tone. You might, if you're following the way the IMF is changing its forecast downwards, and in very, very, very recent times you've been hearing about we may have something starting towards the end of this year. I am not very optimistic, I must say. But the fact is, once these economies continue to be in difficulty, we in the Caribbean will be in grave difficulty. And as I indicated, the IMF and the World Bank are going downward all the time. This is a picture of the indebtedness here. And you'll see leading the pack is what seems to be a relatively stable country, St. Kitts and Nevis, with GDP to debt to GDP ratio of 180. Economists normally use a figure of about 50%, and even in the case of Trinidad and Tobago, and this was in 2007, right? It has actually gone up in recent times, but this is the latest picture I had in my file, so I pulled it for you. Trinidad and Tobago was already around 30%, and it's closer to 40 now. The bad figure is 50. And if you look at a country like Jamaica, who is second on the list, the figure is close to 140, and most of that, strangely enough, is domestic debt and not foreign debt. In the Trinidad and Tobago case, the Trinidad and Tobago foreign debt is relatively good as well, but it is increasingly becoming indebted to the local sector. So that is not a good picture, and the central bank governor referred to it a few days ago, that our indebtedness is likely to be a source of serious problems for us, because what we earn, we are likely to have to repay in debt before we do anything else. So where do we go from here? Now, we cannot predict the current performance based on what has happened, and notwithstanding a lot of the serious packages that have been pumped, for instance, Barrow and Krugman disagree on the Obama intervention. Barrow thinks it's not going to work and is quite against it, whereas Krugman, in fact, that's why he called him a bonehead economist. Krugman, I think, who was actually in the formulation of these policies, is fairly convinced that it would go on. The diversified economy in Trinidad and Tobago and elsewhere means that we will have very little to fall back on, because the oil has gone through for us, or is going through. Gas in particular, the oil has gone up, but the gas, if you look at it, and Trinidad and Tobago is more a gas economy these days. The gas prices are still relatively flat. And in the case of tourism, remittances for Barbados, Jamaica, and other countries, those receipts are falling away very, very rapidly, and there's very little to fall back on. And precisely at a time when we may need some sort of foreign assistance, you heard from the previous speaker that such foreign assistance may not be forthcoming to assist in the further diversification of the economy. At a time, in the case of Trinidad and Tobago, when diversification should have been the foremost word, that has not been happening, and it's only this very, very late hour, and I think we could still go ahead and do it, that some diversification should be good. I'm just saying that I would like to think at least individuals should be ready to deal with themselves, and these are some simple recommendations for the simple human beings. I recommend that we invest in ourselves, human capital in particular, as it is going to be more and more the case, especially what people are calling knowledge-based economies, that we are going to be more important than the physical elements there. This is not advice that I'm charging you for, so don't jump on it. And it's not to say that if you could read it, I'm going to move it very, very quickly, because I'm not too sure about it either, because I'm not taking my own advice on these on some of these matters. But I mean, I do not have a lot of spare money like some people do, but certainly, I would say if I had the kind of money that Mr. Buffet has in the United States, I would invest in some of these stocks and shares, because if they do revive, I will be even wealthier than before. But for the faint-hearted and the poor like myself, I don't recommend it too much. You have to be extremely careful about it. I want to speak relatively importantly, though, about the determining role of governments in this country. Already the manufacturing sectors here and elsewhere in the Caribbean are calling for stimulus packages in the same vein as the Obama administration. I advise the governments of this region to be extremely careful. The U.S. economy is a consumer-based economy, and a lot of the spending in the United States stays in the United States of America. Any such stimulus of consumer spending is likely to result in the Americans getting richer, because the monies we get, we spend on foreign goods. We have what is called a high propensity to import. So the stimulus package, if there is one, and I think there should be one of encouragement, of giving tax breaks, for instance, to firms that involve in innovative activity, R&D activity, innovative activity, tending to support export-oriented activity in the sense of exchange, foreign exchange earning activity. And that is fundamentally what I am saying. I'm saying that the stimulus package will be based on innovative platforms and must not be interventions simply to save jobs. That is not going to last anyway. So to the extent that you intervene simply to save a job today, and you do not give the manufacturing sector, for instance, or other sectors, the wherewithal to survive in the future, those jobs will be lost eventually anyway. So it's not going to work. Too much in the past in Trinidad and Tobago and in the rest of the Caribbean, we have invested, we have given tax incentives to the manufacturing sector, which has simply resulted in the enriching of members of that sector and no real development of the country. In fact, in the case of Trinidad and Tobago, the government had to intervene and undertake its own activity to And if these things don't work, we are likely to have very, very serious consequences. It does not look good. So if I were to conclude very quickly, the economy here and elsewhere is on very, very shaky ground. I love the optimism of some of our leaders, and I really wish that they were going to be right, because if they are wrong and I am right, the consequences for all of us will be very negative. And I'm speaking about consequences, not just the economic type consequence. I'm talking about social unrest, which we have seen in the past, and so on. In fact, my own feeling is that in some of the big countries, you're going to see social unrest. I'm already seeing some indications of it in the United States of America and in Europe, particularly in France. And in France, in the Caribbean, I don't know if some of you are aware that Martinique and Guadeloupe were in open revolt a few weeks ago. And Martinique and France, they are in the Caribbean, but they are Europe in the Caribbean. They're part of Europe. They're part of France. And so my own suspicion is that that kind of thing will happen here, even with greater ferocity, because we are closer to being failed states. I'm not saying that we are, that's not true. But the countries of the Caribbean are closer to the brink of anarchy, and it's a question that is worrying me, that we are so close, we are on the tipping edge of anarchy because of the likely non-performance in the economic sector. My own feeling, in the case of the Caribbean, many of the countries are going to see 0 to negative growth. There isn't going to be anything like the 8% or the 6% that China and India are talking about. Trinidad and Tobago, which started talking about 6%, and Trinidad and Tobago is the best of them all. Trinidad and Tobago is likely to be just over 0%. At the central bank governor concurs with that. And I mean, on a mathematical scale, as you well know, 0 is here. On the one side, there are positive numbers. On the next side, there are negative numbers. So we could very well be close to negative numbers. Some of the social programs that we have are likely to be under threat, and I'm speaking about GATE in particular for this university. ERP and CPEP, which some of you don't know, and I'll say what they are given if the time comes. They are likely to go last, but they are not for political reasons. I do believe that the diversification on the innovative type platform that I've talked about is still possible, giving the incentives, but this is at a time when the governments are running out of revenue and are unlikely to have the wherewithal to finance that kind of innovation through tax breaks. If anything, they are now looking for more tax revenue and are not really in a position to give in. And as I said, and as has been said, getting funding from abroad is going to be more and more difficult to do this. Whatever happens, the time is now crucially upon the Caribbean to foster efficiency, productivity, and international competitiveness. Thank you very much.
I think after that rather sobering analysis by Dr. Watson, the only source of optimism is a search for new directions. And it is that I would like to address myself to for a few moments here this morning. When the crisis first surfaced in 2007, 2008, there was an interesting debate that emerged at the initial stage as to whether this was indeed a crisis in globalization or not. And then some argued, no, it was indeed a crisis in capitalism and how it works. And a third group said both of those were really a misrepresentation of the nature of the situation before us. And what it was really was a crisis in economic theory and practice. And that is where I want to depart in today's discussion, by looking at the implication of this crisis to the exercise of economic policy in our environment today, both from a global perspective and from a Caribbean perspective. What we must first assess is what has been the preconditions upon which our economic growth strategy has developed in most part of the developing world, and indeed in the advanced economies as well. I think it is very clear that the prescription for economic development, and Mr. Kapoor referred to the challenge of the development model, was based on a number of assumptions, one of which was that growth and development will be export-led. And all countries embarked on various programs to create that condition of an export-led growth strategy for development. This was felt to be the main thrust for international competitiveness, and open trade became the order of the day. The second basic preconditions for the development and economic strategy was for ensuring a stable macro framework as reflected by either the debt to GDP ratio or indeed the fiscal balance. And the search for fiscal stability was the second pillar upon which the growth strategy was developed. The third pillar was there was a need for an access and use of that access for capital inflows, whether it was through foreign investment or through foreign borrowings, or in some other countries through foreign remittances. And the fourth pillar of that strategy was the dependence of the social safety net on the transfer of resources from the state. That essentially was the main thrust upon which the social safety net was being built. And finally, in terms of the regulatory challenges of the financial system, the question then was what were the best practices and to what extent would countries that were emerging or want to get into the platform of real development follow those best practices, particularly with respect to the monetary and that was the premises upon which development strategy was based in the past, and perhaps still so. And some countries fit that particular model for economic expansion and growth. What, however, have been some of the short-term prescriptions resulting from the events of the last year and a half or 2 years? The first prescription that seemed to have come onto the table is a new tendency for policy convergence towards protectionism, and in particular towards financial protectionism. So we are faced now with a new challenge. The second challenge is that we have all moved into what has been called, if not doing, but thinking, about deficit financing in search for some kind of stimulus. But that at itself raises issues of which Patrick spoke about on the question of the debt sustainability. And the great temptation that will be before policymakers and central bankers is to monetize this debt, which essentially, in the final analysis, will be leading towards inflationary pressures. The third prescription for the present, now that capital inflows are dried up, is to look carefully at the global financial system and to what extent it has a bias against those countries that have traditionally sourced those capital inflows as a means for their own survival. Of course, the issue of foreign investment is still important, and the appetite for that, of course, is now reduced, and it will be more reduced with respect to small economies. Those economies that are in fact enclaved of the larger global economy, like Trinidad and Tobago, may find some comfort that their enclaved relationship with the global economy may continue to have foreign investment in sectors like the energy sector. But even that seems to be under some concern. But the third and perhaps most important area, in my view, on this issue has to deal with the international reserve system. Joseph Stiglitz, a well-known economist of high reputation, in a recent study in Globalization Must Work, identified the alarming figures that the use of the dollar as a reserve is tantamount to US borrowings from, and the size of that was far greater than the size of all ODI transfers to the developing world. In other words, that is likely now to be under some kind of threat. The other area that we must deal with in terms of the prescriptions for the present is the risk that one is facing with respect to the maintenance, or at least the redesigning of the social security net. And in this respect, we have already seen the tremors in most countries of the world on the viability of the pension system, which is but one important aspect of the social safety net that must be addressed. And many countries are now engaged in various challenges as to the fundability of the pension systems, and therefore put a very vulnerable group in the society at great risk. In addition to that, of course, there are other areas of the safety net that will now be at risk. And finally, in terms of the issue of what is before us, the whole notion that we must follow best practices in international financial regulation has now been turned on its head. For it is those very best practices that are now being identified as the major underlying cause of the financial side of this economic crisis. So the issue is no longer following best practices, but indeed following new practices that must now emerge out of the regulatory challenge before us. Those, therefore, have led one to look carefully at what we must in fact do. And one of the rather paradoxical situations that has emerged is that what we must do in the short term is really in opposition to what we must do in the long term. For in the short term, we must indeed find ways in which to develop endogenous growth and perhaps lead to protectionist measures. And already some of the social and political discontent of which Patrick spoke about could easily be traced to that strategy of moving towards protectionism. Even very recently, the US government had to alter its position on free trade somewhat in their relationship with the rest of the world. So protectionism is what we got to do today. Free trade is what we got to do tomorrow. Deficit financing, whether it is through stimulus packages or any other form, is what we need to do today. But debt sustainability is what we need to do tomorrow. The high cost of capital is what we have to overcome today. But maintaining the competitiveness of the economy is what we have to do tomorrow. Short-term payouts in the social safety net is what we have to do today. But long-term accumulation of capital for sustained safety nets, or however you call it, is what we have to do tomorrow. And the involvement of a political economy as distinct from the real economy or from the financial economy is what we may have to do today. Whereas for tomorrow, we must go back to the issue of market discipline as the main allocator and creator of wealth. So those stark distinctions about the policies that must be followed today are at opposition to the policies that must be followed tomorrow. This raises a critical issue. And that is why I said earlier that I believe that it was really a crisis in economic theory itself and in the practice that follows the prescriptions emerging out of economic theory. That is a rather big assertion. But nonetheless, it is somewhere in there that we must search for the answers to give us the sense of comfort that is absolutely necessary, and more important, the sense of confidence that we know what we are doing. It is very clear today that most countries of the world will not say with great confidence that what they are doing is the right thing. We are modeling through a system, trying to create at times a sense of confidence by official statements, but in private conversations recognizing that we really do not know where we are going and what will happen in the short term. Hence, there are those varying views as to whether or not this is indeed is a V-shaped recession or a U-shaped recession, or indeed, at worst, is it an L-shaped recession? No one is able to identify what is the nature of the recession before us. Depending on that determination, one can then prescribe a path forward. What therefore is at stake is a real challenge of the will to lead in a period of turbulence. And that will to lead must reflect itself in new directions. And one such direction is clearly to look at the new growth path that must be followed by many countries that have been previously described as emerging, and certainly for countries of small economies. Mr. Kapoor said that the larger economies are doing fairly well, and capital inflows have begun to start. Of course, the size of even those larger economies in the total global economy is still relatively small, and therefore its ripple effect to the rest of the world may be selective to those economies that have not yet decoupled from those economies. So we need, therefore, to search for a new path for growth for small economies. And that, I believe, is a challenge that I hope that this conference will embark upon. Given the dichotomy between what must be done tomorrow and what is being done today, there is a need for a search for a new growth path. Whether that new growth path can be predicated on the old assumptions of yesterday's growth path is a question that I will raise in this audience. I hope perhaps that the United Nations can play an important role, being a body that is seen as not having any particular biases, or sometimes not any particular powers, therefore gives it its position to create a new kind of dialogue between the international institutions like the IMF and the World Bank and perhaps the World Trade Organization to search for a new growth path, if only for small economies. But I do believe this is required for even the larger economies. Those economies that have been decoupled, like in Africa, and to some extent not integrated in the international financial system and therefore have been saved some of the immediate pitfalls, are not likely to have comfort in a world in which there is fundamental contraction and a permanent loss of wealth. Because at the bottom of all this, there has been a permanent loss of wealth. And therefore, there is no hope that we can regain that wealth that has been lost unless we find ways to recreate the process by which wealth is created in the world and certainly in the economies. What, therefore, we must do in the region is to stop the pretense. Stop the pretense that business as usual is all we have to do, and that there's only a blip in the sky, and that one day, in the case of Trinidad and Tobago, the price of oil will return to its high levels, and we will be all once more be able to move along the merry path of prosperity for the political economy. Not prosperity for the real economy, not prosperity for the financial economy, but prosperity for the political economy. If that becomes the objective of political advancement in our country, then we are in for an even rougher ride. How it will reflect itself in the future, I am not here to even contemplate. But what I do think is that we cannot put our eyes in the sand and carry on as if this will soon pass as everything else will. The evidence that have come so far have made it very clear that the tables have turned. The IMF, which was once the instrument for bringing discipline to the emerging markets and countries that are searching for international financial access, has now become, or ought to become, the agency for bringing discipline to the advanced economies of the world. As someone said at a recent seminar which I attended, that the small economies have not done anything wrong to be able to have to pay the price of this international financial crisis. In fact, they have earned their keep from being countries that were on the verge of survival at one time, to the point of being able to say that they have sustained a development path, and more recently, to have begun to become confident that they have built the resilience. But this resilience were in fact put to the test by the external shocks, both of the financial nature and now of the real economy sector. And in that sense, the IMF's discipline has not worked in their favor. To the contrary, the same discipline and conditionalities that were imposed on these economies in the past perhaps are now very relevant to the larger economies like in the United States, who may not pass the test of IMF discipline at this stage. And the second tables that have turned, which I mentioned rather briefly, is the issue of the dollar-denominated reserve system, and whether that will go under some kind of tailspin in the future. And already, in my view, the entire financial crisis has now moved on to the stage of currency devaluations and currency changes. I see that as the next phase in which we will be faced. What implication that will have for the dollar reserve system in the long-term future is a matter that should be placed on the agenda, because it affects our individual countries rather directly. That, to me, is where the tables have turned again. And in that sense, the debate, I said, which once felt that this was an exercise of a crisis in capitalism, later to be seen as possibly a crisis in globalism, indeed is a crisis in how can we recreate the knowledge and the new assumptions upon which the growth path in the future will be based, and how we can really become optimistic, if we can, by creating a new path and a new model for development in small economies. That is the challenge of an academic conference of this nature, and I hope this will be just the beginning for that. Thank you.
It's very difficult to follow from these outstanding presentations, being the last speaker. I was deeply involved in a conference we had last week on the implications of the global meltdown for the financial sector in the Caribbean. And at that conference, the concern was that there are tremendous economic difficulties that are likely to spill off from the global recession. And as a result, there was concern about the stability of the financial sector in the Caribbean. Well, we discussed it, and one of the things we could not escape from is the fact that foreign exchange earnings is the key for survival of the various Caribbean economies. And the foreign exchange earnings themselves were under threat. And when that happens, then one has to be concerned. The threat that emerges really is with respect to the external current account earnings and the external capital account earnings. And what we have seen really is that we now are suffering what I would call a double whammy effect, if you're familiar with that word, whammy. But what really is happening here is that the external current accounts of the Caribbean has actually reduced substantially. Most countries, however, when they suffer external current account deficits, rely on the external capital accounts to help to cushion the effects of the depressed current account earnings. When we look at the data for last year, and our center recently finished its report for the economic performance of the Caribbean economies in 2008, what has happened really is that the external capital account could not cushion the downturn in external current accounts. So that what we have really is deficits happening in the external current account and insufficient inflows of external capital to cushion the effect of the external current accounts. So that has been a serious problem that has affected us. Nevertheless, the Caribbean economies has done well in terms of the fact that most of them have been able to realize positive economic growth, but reduced economic growth. However, 3 countries are actually showing negative economic growth already, and that is the Bahamas, Jamaica, and there's another country somewhere here, I forgot to put in my note. But they have actually been the ones suffering the negative economic growth. But others have been able to have growth, but under 2% in most cases. Trinidad and Tobago and Suriname would be exceptions because Trinidad and Tobago realized growth of over 3%, and Suriname over 6%. So they have done remarkably well. Now, in terms of the reserves, the countries have actually, the reserves have not fallen away. External reserves have not fallen away. But what has happened really is that most of the countries have been unable to show reserves of 3 months or over. The benchmark used in the Caribbean is reserves of under 3 months. That's 3 months import cover. And most of the countries have not been able to do that, except Trinidad and Tobago and Suriname again. They have been able to show reserves, and very high reserves as well, of 9%, of 9 months import cover, sorry, and Suriname even above that. So the Caribbean economies are feeling the pinch, and one would have asked, well, are these economies able to at least use external financing by borrowing and so on? The difficulty here really is that some countries are already highly indebted. You have, for example, Jamaica. Well, Belize is the most highly indebted of the countries in the Caribbean, with debt measuring 74.8% of GDP. And the ECCU, that's the Eastern Caribbean countries, they have a debt to GDP ratio of 46%. These countries have really, are really feeling the effects of the recession because they have very little policy room to wiggle out of the current situation because the debt is very high. Now, the other problem that has really confronted us, and some of the speakers spoke about it before, is that the economic paradigms that we have been forced to implement, and some of it by way of conditionalities, have actually been working against us. And in fact, some of the weaknesses of these paradigms are showing up now. So, for example, part of the conditionalities had included countries should liberalize their economies, and that would have meant liberalize your exchange rates, move to flexible exchange rates, because everything was based on the market system. Well, some countries in the region stood their ground and said, well, we would continue with our fixed exchange rates because that works well for us. Well, when you look at the evidence now, what we see is that the countries who went to the flexible exchange rates are the ones who are reflecting higher inflation than the rest of the Caribbean. And there's another thing that compounds it. Having flexible exchange rates might sound good, but then you have a problem where you have your credit rating agencies, and credit rating agencies actually can reap havoc with respect to the stability of the foreign exchange markets within the countries. So Jamaica is a good example of this. Many credit rating agencies evaluated Jamaica and downgraded Jamaica. And of course, they put them below investment grade. What has happened as a result? Well, the foreign suppliers of goods to Jamaica then said, well, you know, you are below investment grade, and therefore it's risky for us to extend credit lines to you. And because we cannot extend credit lines to you, it means then that you have to pay upfront, you have to pay cash. Well, what has happened there is that created an extraordinary demand for foreign exchange in the market, and therefore put the Bank of Jamaica under pressure to defend the exchange rate. I mean, even though it's floating, they would like to maintain the exchange rate somewhere. So it put them under pressure to maintain the exchange rate. And as a result of that, the exchange rate depreciated dramatically in Jamaica. You also had problems where there were excessive speculation against the dollar, because when the dollar moves away from being fixed and to be flexible, it now means that speculators can have a field day actually betting that the dollar will depreciate further. And of course, when they succeed, they are happy and they will continue another rounds of betting again. So what has happened really is that excessive speculative activity, together with the credit rating agencies downgrading the market of the country, could actually cause further rounds of depreciation of the currency. And with that, it causes international debt to increase as well. Because the countries now they are highly indebted, but as the exchange rate depreciates, it causes the debt, when measured in local currency, to escalate. And this is the case in Jamaica again. The debt in local currency actually increased by 85% in 2008 mainly because of the depreciation of the exchange rate. So these are some of the challenges with respect to the theory that Mr. Dukaran spoke about a while ago. There's actually need to reform these theories, and therefore the conditionalities provides, well, the conditionalities that we have to follow, I think we have to try our best to be as resistant to these conditionalities as we can. If we can join forces together, because we may not be able to do it unilaterally, but if we can join forces to actually fight against these kinds of conditionalities that we are forced to follow in a stable exchange rate. But monetary policy, as it is, cannot really embark on development of the country. Therefore, the governments are forced to embark on fiscal policy, on development through fiscal policy. But the difficulty here is that where would they get the extra resources from, given that the pie from which they're drawing funds is actually diminishing? Now, some countries like Jamaica were able to borrow from multilateral institutions like the IDB and the CDB. Well, CDB is Caribbean Development Bank. Right, so they have been able to borrow from these institutions at concessionary rates. The problem is, however, that this adds to the debt accumulation. And the hope is that someday the economy will turn around and they'll be able to repay these loans. However, if you have a hostile international environment, then that just simply forces the country to engage in another rounds of borrowing, and therefore the borrowing will increase and increase. So one wonders then, how would the cycle end? This is another problem that faces the region at present. We have some of the most highly indebted countries in the world existing within our economic integration movement, that is CARICOM, that is Caribbean Community. And we're not too certain how these countries would be able to escape from the debt situation unless there's some kind of international cooperation that's happened with Guyana, where there was a HIPC relief program, and so the countries were granted debt forgiveness. So this is another challenge that the region faces then, how to escape this rungs of debt and cycle of debt overhang. So I just touched on a few points, and I know the time is limited, so I will not go on any further. But thanks very much.
I'd like to open the floor for questions. We've heard a number of common threads between our four participants, that the crisis did not start in the developing world, but has already had a tremendous impact in the developing countries, and particularly here in the Caribbean. Patrick speaks of a hurricane phenomena where old remedies need not to apply, and shared with us a number of perspectives of the impact of this crisis in Trinidad and Tobago, even with the resilience of Trinidad and Tobago. Anthony shared with us his views on financial, fiscal, and monetary policies and some of the implications for the region. Mr. Dukaran talks about new directions and challenges to rethink some of the old policies and how we can learn from the past and formulate a new vision. And Davish Kapoor outlined a number of systemic effects of the crisis with shifts from the North America, European mode or access to the developing world, the need for new global governance structures, and the role of IMF and other financial institutions, and the impact worldwide. Some very interesting thoughts and perspectives. I'd like to open the floor for questions. We'll take 3 questions or 4 questions at a time and invite the participants to address them. Jane, I see your hand here, and then a gentleman here on the left. So Jane, please.
Thank you for 4 fascinating and very thoughtful presentations. I have 2 questions. One is, it seems to me that one of the things we need to look at is not just the people who are suffering right now, but there are people out shopping. I have a stepson who works for the biggest petrochemical company in Canada, which now belongs to an Abu Dhabi sovereign wealth fund, which evidently owns almost all of the big petrochemical companies in the world. So it seems to me we need to be looking also at the where, you know, who are the people that are out buying up the bargains that are going bankrupt? So I think that's one question I'd like to some feedback on from the panel. The other is the gender balance in all of this. For the first time in the history of the United States, there are more women in the job market than men. Men are losing jobs in the financial sector and the manufacturing sector. They're losing jobs that are making large amounts of money. The women, who are often making much less than their husbands or their partners, are now often the ones who are the breadwinners. It seems to me there could be a lot of social and very gendered consequences of this shift. I think it's also happening in Canada. I don't know where else it's happening in the world, but I wonder what the consequences are going to be of this big shift in the gendered structure of not only who's doing the work, but who's bearing the burden of caring for families and things like that. Okay.
Thank you, Jane. The gentleman here on the left, if you can identify yourself.
I'm Keston Perry of the University of the West Indies. Thank you very much again for very enlightening and interesting presentations. My question, though, very eloquent and very enlightening presentation, Mr. Dukaran. My question deals with the idea of protectionism, and I'm not certain whether or not you were advocating for protectionism, but I want to find out how viable and how sustainable such a policy would be for Caribbean states or for small states or states of the South, given that the G7 countries have already stated unequivocally that they do not want a protectionist climate within which to manage or maneuver in this financial crisis. And whether or not this type of protectionism will further marginalize small states, or whether or not you're saying that this policy should, countries should insulate themselves a bit more in the global financial system. Thank you.
Yes, okay. This is the last question, and then we'll ask our panelists to answer them.
Good morning. Good morning, I'm Anthony Philip Spencer.
I think you need to speak directly.
Okay. Good morning. Thank you. I'm Anthony Philip Spencer. I'm an alumnus of UE's Economics Department and the Institute of International Relations. My question is really driven by a concern over the international system's ability to reconcile how we account for value on the one hand and wealth on the other. The fact that there are people shopping is because there are some people with wealth, while right now there are some people losing wealth. I referred to the comment, to the presentation, but first I appreciated both presentations that I was here for. I missed the other two, my apologies. But the particular comment by Mr. Dukaran, which says that there's a permanent loss of wealth, really indicates that there was a previously ignored gap between created wealth and measured wealth that we must now really fully examine. And the question is, what do you think is the correlation between the current earnings reward regime or rule sets, if I could use that term, that dominate the international financial system and the allocation of the value that is assigned to the gap that exists between what we refer to as measured wealth and created wealth? Of course, issues of risk and so on and credit enter into how we define the gap. But my concern is really driven by the fact that we have not been able to reconcile within the international financial system the difference between value and wealth and how we account for the gap
between measured wealth and created wealth. Who really holds the wealth that has been created, and who has been assigned wealth that has not been created? Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Dukanan, a couple questions for you on the issue of protectionism and wealth and value. I know that Devish will want to address some of the questions addressed by Jane and Patrick and Anthony as well. So over to you.
Well, I think some very penetrating questions. First, the question of protectionism. It's not a matter of advocating it. I'm saying in the short term, the situation will lead towards protectionism. But for tomorrow, it should really go back to free trade. And therefore, there is a dichotomy here as to how in the short term you can proceed to try and create internal markets for your population and at the same time create the international competitiveness that is required in the future. So it's really not a choice for protectionism that was raised. It is a point that is in fact the tendency. And our challenge is to be able to protect the economic situation in the country, and protectionism may be used, but at the same time, it must not be done at the expense of international competitiveness, which is where I think we'll end up being in the long run. The interesting question about value and wealth. Yes, the traditional approach is that rewards must somehow be linked to added value. If your rewards in an economy is equivalent to the value you add to that economy, then you are really getting your fair share of your work. The fact that that particular equation did not hold has been the result of this situation where economies began to live way above their means, and they were in fact reaping rewards way beyond the value that they've created to the global economy. And that is at the source of the problem in the financial sector. And hence, the whole issue as to whether or not that sector, and essentially the financial sector, has been described as a greedy sector by many people, and whether or not there was lax regulation that allowed values to be much greater, and rewards rather to be much greater than the added value. So you're right, I think the permanent loss of wealth has been linked to that. But the ideal situation is to try and have policies that will ensure that there is an equitable distribution of the rewards based on the values that people make to the economy. I want to respond to 2 points that Jane requested on the question of there is apparently still some profligacy existing. And there are two reasons for that. In our world, even in the simple case of Trinidad and Tobago, you're not going to see everybody suffering in the same way. Imagine, for instance, you are, even like myself, not rich, but in a fairly steady job with a reasonably good salary, and let's say car prices are falling. I may find that it is now worth my while to buy a car before the prices pick back up. So you're going to see some of that, but the general trend for car sales is downward. And that is what is pushing the prices down, which means that people who have a little something in the coffers could take advantage of it. And that is always going to happen. People who are in a better position and who have, we all respond. I mean, TV tells us, for instance, that when incomes fall, we cut spending. But if you have wealth to back it up, if you have some wealth which is not eroded yet to back it up, you will continue to spend, at least not as, you would not cut as much as the person who does not have that to fall back on it. It's as simple as that. So we see individuals and some individual countries behaving in certain ways. But there are the stories of people in Dubai driving their Benz to the airport and abandoning it and things like that. There are these stories as well.
In the case of the gender balance, I'll hazard a response here. The world, if you, as a teacher like myself, you stand in front of your EC 101 class, I'm just calling a name, that course does not exist anymore. You look at the class and you'll see 2/3 of the class is made up of women. If anything, this crisis may have precipitated the advent of the woman in the superior position in numbers, but that was coming. That it certainly was something that was coming by just looking at the evidence before you on a day-to-day basis. The women are taking over the world. It's a problem for people like myself. I worry about it. I must say, and I've actually spoken publicly about it, although it's not my specialty. I think we are an endangered species. We are the last of the macho men. This is the end of the line. And when we look behind us, who we see coming are women, and that is the reality. And it is true that men dominated the financial sector, and when that suffered, the women who are in the other jobs, environmental type jobs, some of the jobs with a lot of heart, some of that, because women are attracted to jobs like that and they continue to do so more and more. But even the heartless jobs that they're being attracted to more and more. So when we look around, that's what we see, that the women are taking over. So this crisis, I don't think, has made it happen. This crisis has simply made it more obvious what is the future anyway.
Just two comments. One, I think the subject of protectionism has been repeated a few times. I think, one remarkable thing we should keep in mind is that despite the severity of the economic and financial crisis, in general, there has not been too much protectionism. There have been some calls, but I think the global system has held up, and I think that we should give some credit where it's due. Whether it's the WTO or other system, that by and large there's been more movement on financial protectionism, but on trade protectionism, it's actually been rather modest if you look at what's actually happened. Yes, trade has declined, but it's not declined because of protectionism. It's declined because of the contraction of economic activity. On the first question on buying sort of global assets, about 1 to 2 years ago, there was a huge amount of literature on the growth of sovereign wealth funds, which is the one you're referring to. Actually, I don't think you're right. In the case of petrochemicals, which I'm reasonably well aware, there is much more diversified. It's not the case that Abu Dhabi or any other Middle East country has a very high concentration of assets or owes most of it. There is a lot of competition, and yes, they did they did buy some assets in North America, not just Abu Dhabi, but also SABIC, which is the Saudi one, but it still is a very diversified ownership structure. I think the country that has been buying in this crisis the most number of assets, not in manufacturing, a little bit in manufacturing, but mainly in sort of things like iron ore and so on, is of course the People's Republic of China. And it's buying these assets a lot, whether it's in Australia or in Africa, and that is something that remains to be seen, what the consequences will be.
When I heard the first question about the question you asked about some people spending while some people are not able to spend, I thought of it in an international context in terms of how countries are able to trade with each other. And my own question to your question is really, right, given the global crisis that has been happening mainly in the advanced industrialized countries, now I think is the best time more than ever to actually foster South trade. That is trade between developing countries. How that is to happen, I do not know. But the thing is that what is clear is that you need some kind of decoupling of trade in the sense that developing countries who themselves will not directly have not been directly affected by the crisis, indirectly of course, but not directly, could actually themselves trade and therefore help to develop their economies. So that's a question I am raising to your question.
I'm looking at Pat. We will take another round of questions. So I'll take 4 questions. There's a gentleman there next to Jane and the lady behind. If you can identify yourselves, and we'll go one at a time.
I'm Matt Bishop from the University of Sheffield in the UK, soon to be IIR here at UE. I've got a couple of questions, one for Professor Kapoor and one for Professor Watson. For Professor Kapoor, if possible, I'd just like to push you a bit on some of the things you said about the IMF. You suggested that some of the bigger countries are going to have to start borrowing from the IMF, and there's going to be a loosening of the conditionality regime. Now, it's my understanding that the extra $500 billion that has been pledged, President Obama's had quite a lot of trouble getting their section, the US's portion of that, through Congress. And a lot of that money is at the moment still just pledged. And secondly, on the conditionality issue, so the corollary of that the first point is that the IMF doesn't actually have that much money. I mean, it couldn't really even underwrite just the UK banking system, let alone, you know, any bigger, any more than that. And then on the conditionality issue, it's my understanding that Latvia and Ukraine have recently taken big loans. And the conditionality has been more of the same. Latvia has slashed its public sector budget. The Ukraine has still been pressured to keep the liberalisation agenda up. So I just wonder if you could comment on that, please. And for Professor Watson, in terms of diversification, I just wonder about agriculture. It strikes me that in the Caribbean, there's always been this assumption recently that export agriculture has declined. Well, what about domestic agriculture? What about food security? What about production for Caribbean export? What about institutionalizing and some kind of guiding of the state in order to engender, you know, serious agricultural development to guard against rises in food prices in the future, which are bound to come around again as commodities explode at some point in the near future. So I just wonder if you'd mind commenting on that, please. Thanks.
Yes, good morning. My name is Catherine Skiddercat, Vancouver Island University in Canada. I was very interested to hear in several presentations, and one more specifically, Professor Weston, the comment about economic theory and the potential for change in certain fundamental conceptualization of development. And I think it's a theme that has come at least in 3 of the presenters' comments. And on the other hand, it seems to me that, such as Greenspan, you know, he admitted that his model was erroneous, and the crisis that took place was largely due to this fundamental belief in market liberalization. On the other hand, the presenter who talked about what we're doing today and what we're going to go back tomorrow. So it seems that there is this, okay, economic theory was wrong, and development problems such as the debt crisis came from that. But at the same time, we're going to go back to that. Like, we're going to fix this in the short term, but we're going to go back to that. So to what extent exactly do any of the presenters feel that this crisis is actually going to create a conceptual fundamental change in economic theory? Thanks.
I just have a quick question. Given the story that Anthony told about the pressures on the Jamaican currency and Patrick's contention that the Caribbean countries are so closely linked to the American economy already, I'm just wondering if dollarization is on the agenda for any Caribbean country.
Any other questions? Yeah.
When I listened to Professor Dearcoran's presentation on economic theory and practice, a crisis of economic theory and practice, I asked myself, where did the influence come from historically on issues of orthodoxies in theory and practice? And so without going back too far and thinking about the work of Arthur Lewis. I think of the work of the Brandt Commission. And the Brandt Commission on North-South, it sought to look at the world and it sought to give some prescriptions of policy and possibly theory. So my question concretely is that if you feel that one needs to influence economic theories and practices of the future, might it be time to have a new type of Brandt Commission that would, because when I look at the debates, I see Paul Krugman engaging in all kinds of debates in the columns of the New York Times, and Professor Watson referred to this Barrow, whom I don't know who he is. I assume he's not Errol Barrow, our guy. But I think that somehow or the other, we shouldn't leave the debates to these guys like Krugman and whatnot on the pages of the New York Times. Maybe we need a new Brandt Commission. I'd appreciate your comment on that. Thanks.
Okay. Over to our panelists to address these 4 very interesting questions. Who would like to go first? Mr. Dukaran.
I think there are two questions I picked up that I would like to just give a brief comment on. The issue of agricultural diversification in the Caribbean and the notion of food security. In fact, and my friend comment on there isn't very much protectionism. In the area of food, there has been, within recent times, countries that have decided to ban the exportation of food in the name of not so much food security as much as food sovereignty, as the issue that is now engaging those in this field, that is control over the sources of food, as opposed to just security, which is the control over the supplies. And that is a tendency towards a protectionist measure. And if we were to do it in the Caribbean, which has eluded us for all these years, it will tend to be a kind of policy that will generate endogenous growth, which is where we got to go. And that is the point I was making earlier, that in the short term, you've got to do that in any event because your capacity to have food security by buying food is going to be reduced. And therefore, you have to go into an endogenous growth in food production. And it has eluded us. It's a technical, much more a technical issue. It is a whole political economy issue, which has to be addressed, but it should be done. So I agree with that. The question of whether or not I would say that economic theory is fundamentally flawed. I'm not too sure I'm ever would be in a position to make such an assertion. But what I can say is that the prescriptions for today, in fact, is in opposition to the requirements for tomorrow. And that is our challenge for economic theory. How do we satisfy the immediate prescriptions like deficit financing on one hand? Seems to be a legitimate prescription for today. But at the same time, the requirement for tomorrow is debt sustainability. And even in the larger economies, that issue is now rearing its head in terms of all the funds that have been pushed into the financial sector and who is going to pay for that and when and how. So I am saying that the that's my real point. Now, how do you find a trajectory to accept what is required today, but do not nullify what is required tomorrow is an issue of economic prescriptions. It may require us to question some of our assumptions. And I do think that the assumptions of IMF conditionalities will have to be questioned. And to the extent that those assumptions were derived from economic theory, then economic theory will have to be questioned.
I was hoping that Mr. Dukaran would have been a former governor of the central bank, would have addressed the question on dollarization. You forgot. You probably forgot. No. I mean, this has been hotly debated in the region on dollarization, and probably during your time as governor as well. The difficulty is really that we do not print the US dollar. Therefore, there's no seigniorage to be derived. In fact, we will be paying the US government for seigniorage when we dollarize. So that's the problem. And the other thing is that you need you need to pay your debt, but simply dollarizing will not help you in paying your external debt, because all it does really is say that you will use the US dollar for your domestic activities. So that never really got off the ground. It was just debated. But there is still some form of dollarization, and that is where your exchange rate continuously depreciates. You find that people tend to quote prices in US dollars. And so you're dollarized in that sense. So for example, hotels will quote their prices in US dollars as opposed to local currency. And so there's some form of dollarization that is taking place as a result. But to go to full dollarization in terms of using US dollar for transactions purposes, well, to me, it will take quite a lot more for that to actually happen. Now, the question about economic theory, the problem has been really that the economic theory tends to be dominated by the multilateral institutions like the World Bank and IMF. They choose which economic theory they will prescribe, and they follow. And so what you have really, economic theory coming from universities in the advanced industrialized countries. And it actually supplants whatever economists in the developing countries were doing. There's no attention paid to what these economists were actually saying all the years about their own economies. Instead, it is actually supplanted by economic theory coming from the advanced industrialized countries. At least that is how it's perceived. Somebody spoke yesterday about universities, this is not the exact words, but universities actually networking in the developing countries. And this is important because, you see, at the level of journals, for example, where the economic ideas are put forward and so on, this is where these ideas can actually be put in fine economic theory and developed. So I hope that day will come where you will see that happening. With the internet technology, now more journals are going online. So therefore, you might see a more coalition of ideas coming from developing countries, from developing country journals.
The agriculture, we don't have the time. I support the notion of developing agriculture, if only as a thing for absorbing labor. But all the big countries of the world were once great agriculture, were based on agriculture. But now in the United States of America, one farmer could produce what the entire country of Trinidad and Tobago. So there's an advantage in the big countries. France is another example. So yes, whereas I support it, we have to understand that it has to be a different kind of agriculture that we're talking about, agriculture that could at least earn foreign exchange. We, after all, were based on agriculture. The ethnic composition of this country is a result of decisions based on our economic/agricultural sector. We'll have to speak about it, else we don't have the time.
Just 2 points. One, I just want to say on, we had this thing on sort of protectionism in food and agriculture, and Mr. Dukaran is absolutely right, but I want to emphasize that that was not driven by the economic and financial crisis. I mean, protectionism in agriculture has been rife, and for a long time the markets are very distorted, but it's not been the consequence of this particular crisis. So that's all I was saying. On the IMF, I mean, just a few things. One is, you're right that these are pledges, but some of them, like for instance, Japan has pledged like 100 billion. That's independent of the US. The SDR issuance will also, I think, come through, and that also, you know, the role of the US Congress is likely to be much less. So you're right, A, that the total amount of like money is much less than what it ought to be, B, that not all the money will like materialize, but nonetheless, compared to the increase of resources of the IMF in the past, this will be a substantial increase in some resources. Conditionality, you're right, but you know there is a huge difference. The loans to Indonesia in the aftermath of the Asian financial crisis had more than 100 structural conditionalities. The ones now like to Latvia and so on have about 10 to 12. So it's a major, it's an order of magnitude difference between the two.
Thank you. We've had a very interesting set of presentations, and a number of issues have been put on the table. Obviously, all four panelists and myself agree that the crisis is of phenomenal magnitude, and it's too soon to anticipate or to map the impact of this crisis, both in the developed, high middle income, and least developed countries. The United Nations, on its own account, is convening a meeting of the international financial crisis now at the end of June. The meeting, in fact, was happening the last few days, and it was postponed. And the aim of the meeting is to identify emergency and long-term responses to mitigate the impact of this crisis, particularly on vulnerable groups, and initiate a dialogue on the transformation of international financial architecture, taking into account the needs and concerns of the very diverse membership of the UN. The meeting will be 3 days long and will have 4 roundtables. The first looking at crisis on employment, the impact of the crisis on employment, trade and investment, and how it affects the attainment of the MDGs. The second, actions and appropriate measures to mitigate the impact of the crisis on development, and the 3 and 4th roundtables on the role of the United Nations and the member countries in terms of the financial and economic system and architecture and the contributions of the UN to the debate. The presentations by Anthony Birchwood and Dr. Watson, Dr. Dukaran, and Dr. Kapoor have challenged us and provided us with insight and perspectives, whether in economic theory, in the architecture of the financial systems, the impact in Trinidad and Tobago, in the Caribbean, the shifting powers from the developed world to the group like BRICS. And I trust their perspectives will help us in our different roles and capacities to continue to reflect on this issue and to make a difference. We should not leave this crisis go to waste. I thank you, and we'll have now a break, I understand, in the program, and the meetings will continue in the afternoon on a session on the International Criminal Court and small states, and then at the end of the day with the closing ceremony. Thank you.